already mentioned, already flagged here on the program, I'm joined now by Greens Senator Robert Sims, live from Adelaide. Thanks very much for your company.
Thank you, Peter.
Let's get stuck into this interesting story where you guys on the Greens, that is, are talking about wanting to remove religious exemptions to the Sex Discrimination Act in the wider context of this debate around same-sex marriage, obviously, as well. Now, I guess here's the question. I posed this to Katie Gallagher before when she was on To The Point with Christina Keneally and I. It's not an easy one to answer when the question is asked with the wording, why should religious organisations be allowed to discriminate based on gender or sexual orientation or the like? But the answer, I suppose, that is always put is that you would sort of crush the belief structure of the religions were you not to give them the exemption. So what's your answer to that, I guess?
Oh, look, I don't agree with that, Peter. What we're proposing is to remove religious exemptions from federal anti-discrimination laws, because currently the way that those laws apply is it's legal for a school to sack a gay man who's open about their sexuality. A faith-based school can do that. It's legal currently for a faith-based homeless shelter to be able to deny service to a trans young person, for instance. And I think a lot of people would ask in 21st century Australia, how can we have organisations that are getting government funding, we're talking about schools, organisations that provide services to people, being able to deny service on the basis of sexuality or gender identity?
Let's get into that, Senator, because I have to say, I probably agree with you when it comes to that federal funding argument around these sort of religious institutions, particularly schools and the like. But the major parties don't want to go there. Where I don't agree, we'll find out if we're in agreement or not on this, where I think I don't agree is if you're going to extend it to the actual churches, for example. I would not agree with forcing a religious organisation to marry a same-sex couple if it went against their belief. Do you go that far?
No, Peter, and I want to be very clear about this. The Greens in the legislation that we've had before the Parliament for marriage equality have never sought to force religious organisations to perform same-sex marriage. That's different to what we're talking about here. What I'm talking about is federal anti-discrimination laws that deal with things like, as I mentioned, people being employed within schools, things like service provision for some of the most vulnerable members in our community. I think when we're talking about organisations receiving public funds to undertake those things, then it is really inappropriate that they should have a get-out-of-jail card for anti-discrimination laws. The reality is these
Senator,
laws
can I jump in, though? Can I just jump in? Sorry, because I just want to sort of break this down to where we sit on this. So would you be comfortable, as I would, I'm thinking about this as we go, I would be comfortable with religious schools being allowed to do exactly what you're describing were they not receiving government funds?
No. Look, Peter, you talked before about the example of marriage, and certainly under any marriage equality arrangements, there would be the opportunity for people to get married under secular arrangements or other arrangements. What I'm talking about at the moment is anti-discrimination laws that are designed to protect people within the workplace and that are designed to protect people within areas that provide services. The idea that there can be religious exemptions to that and that you can in effect have religious organisations being able to jettison those kind of protections is something that really doesn't have a place in 21st century Australia. And let's not forget, the Labor Party, when they were in government, had a review looking at this. They were open to making a change, but in the end they kowtowed because, of course, we saw the conservative religious right up in arms and the Labor Party folded. And, you know, unfortunately we do see the influence of that conservative wing here in South Australia. Just recently I've seen Don Farrell come back from the political grave, and he and Alex Gallagher have dumped Anne McEwen, who's a progressive person, on the South Australian Labor Party ticket. So the influence of those conservative forces are very clear on the ALP, and that was certainly the case when they were last in government. The Greens opposed that then. We were strong proponents for dealing with this anti-discrimination law, and we're advocating still for those changes to be made.
But can I ask though, see, I join you in your position, as I say, where we talk about funding. I can imagine getting to that next point. We'll talk in a moment about the impact this may have in terms of emboldening the Conservative side of the debate against same-sex marriage, because this is exactly the sort of scare campaign they want to run about what comes after you legalise same-sex marriage. We can get to that. But first up though, I'm in agreement when we're talking about funding being something that you can then want to remove any discrimination. But if a Catholic school, for example, is not going to take funding, government funding, I would have thought it's their entitlement, for me anyway. I'm okay about them choosing something that I'm not personally comfortable with, but nonetheless correlates to their religious faith and the way that they want to run the school.
Well, Peter, I think you'd find that most independent schools in this country get government funding.
Oh,
so
I
I think
agree.
what we're talking about is a pretty rare
change, though.
A pretty rare hypothetical situation. But, you know, do you really think that someone's fitness to perform a job should be based on their sexuality or their gender identity? I mean, is it fair that
but Senator, let me answer
could
that,
be
because
sacked, for instance, if he is open about his sexuality? Because that's precisely the scenario that has been presented to me by people in the community.
The short answer is no, I don't, because I've long been an advocate for same-sex marriage, and I don't like the idea of any discrimination on that path. But I suppose, were I a very strict Catholic or a principal of a Catholic school that was teaching certain positions, that the Catholic Church therefore had a disagreement when it came to you know, the structure or the lifestyle, whatever you want to call it, of somebody who's gay or lesbian, well then maybe I would. And as long as they weren't receiving federal funding, I'd want to respect that religious right, even though it's not something that I agree with.
Well, as I say to you, Peter, I think the scenario that you're presenting is actually a very narrow set of circumstances.
Absolutely, but, I agree with that. They do currently receive a lot of funding, so I'm sort of half agreeing with you, I suppose.
Yeah, look, the reality is we're dealing with a situation in this country where we have private organisations, private schools, many of which have a religious orientation that receive huge amounts of government funding. The point that I am making is that in 21st century Australia, your fitness for a job should not be determined on the basis of your sexuality or your gender identity. It should be on the basis of your capacity to do that job. That's the case in relation to a whole range of other criteria, yet when it comes to sexuality or gender identity, we provide religious organisations with a get-out-of-jail card. And I think that's something a lot of Australians feel uncomfortable with. You've mentioned the point of marriage equality and how organisations may seek to link the two issues. This isn't a debate about marriage equality. This is another issue. And as I've already said, there is no requirement under any of the legislation or bills that have been proposed on the issue of marriage equality to compel ministers of religion to perform marriage ceremonies against their will. That's a separate issue to the one that I'm talking to you about today.
Let me ask you, though, just to play devil's advocate on the other example that you used, which was the idea that a religiously based organisation that helps the homeless, for example, could reject assistance to a transgender person. Again, I don't like that. But the devil's advocate to this would be, wouldn't it, that you risk, and you could argue the same thing in the schooling space, I suppose, you risk driving these religious organisations, which do more good than harm, particularly in the context of the charity example, you risk driving them out altogether, don't you? That if you compelled them to treat both, that they would decide to vacate the space?
Well, one of the problems we have is we've seen over many, many years a failure of both the Labor and Liberal parties to appropriately invest in some of the kind of support work that we're talking about, things like homeless shelters and so on. And so actually what they've done is farmed a lot of that work off to the non-government sector, and they do provide, often in many cases, some government support to facilitate that. But I think support for the most vulnerable in our community should be universal, and we shouldn't be turning people away on the basis of their sexuality or on the basis of their gender identity. I think that's a pretty basic concept. It's one that I think most Australians would agree with. And it's a clear point of difference, let me say, between the Greens and other political parties this election, because we have a proven track record of advocating for equality to be applied across the board with no excuses. And unfortunately, we have two major political parties that are not willing to take on these kind of issues because they are far too captive to the likes of Senator Bernardi on the Liberal side, the likes of Don Farrell on the Labor side, and they're not willing to actually show leadership on these kind of issues.
Good question for Penny Wong. Next time I talk to her, she's the campaign spokesperson. Shouldn't be hard to get her on the program. Robert Sims, we appreciate you joining us. Thanks very much for your company.
Thank you, Peter.
Time for some